What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Every once in a while, Russia produces a character so bizarre, so cartoonishly self-unaware that he accidentally reveals more truth about the system than any opposition investigation ever could. And recently that honor went to Dmitry Rogozin, the self-appointed senator of Zaporizhzhia, a title so imaginary and absurd even the Russian constitution would get confused. I mean, Ukraine does not have senators to begin with. Zaporizhzhia is not Russian, but okay. And yet here he is, dressed in camouflage, recording dramatic confessions from the trenches like some kind of a budget-friendly action hero who never survived the director's cut. And then, long story short, in this hour-long monologue, Rogozin managed to combine battlefield bragging, racial pseudoscience, historical revisionism, and a stunning admission of just how devastating Ukraine's drone forces have become. But beneath all the absurdity lies something far more serious. Rogozin's interview was not merely another episode of Russian propaganda theater. It exposed the catastrophic losses of Russian troops, the psychological collapse of the invaders, the desperation of Kremlin loyalists trying to rationalize disaster, and also the growing realization, both in Russia and abroad, that Putin's war machine is running out of excuses, and also running out of men. So today, let's talk about Rogozin's bizarre video confession, his unmistakable respect for Ukrainian combat innovation, the thousands of Russians dying in Stepnohirsk, and what this entire spectacle says about Putin's mindset and the future of this war. Dmitry Rogozin's role in Russian politics has always been strange, to say the least. But even by his standards, the past months have been a new low. Once a loud nationalist bureaucrat, then the head of Roscosmos, famous for failing to launch half of the rockets he bragged about, Rogozin has now reinvented himself as a frontline warrior. At least that's how he markets it. The reality is that a man just desperately trying to stay relevant by performing patriotism for the camera, while soldiers around him quietly wonder how this guy is still alive. And so in his latest interview, Rogozin unveiled a worldview so drenched in racist delusion that it makes old Soviet propaganda looks like a college diversity seminar. According to him, Ukraine is populated by three groups. Pay attention. True Russians, virus basically, former Russians who supposedly lost their racial purity, and then the remaining substance, literally, that's what he said, an alleged population of people with no Russian identity who are apparently responsible for every cruelty in Eastern European history. Sounds familiar, like something 8 years ago happened, right? He even cited century-old stories of Civil War torture as proof that these groups were never real Russians, conveniently ignoring the fact that most of these atrocities were invented or exaggerated during the Stalin era precisely to justify mass repression. What makes this rhetoric even more grotesque is how casually Rogozin flirts slurs while insisting there is nothing offensive about them. He talks about the Ukrainians defending their homes as they are some kind of wild creatures incapable of human morality. At the same time, he refuses to acknowledge the one truth staring him in the face. None of these men would be dying if the Russian army had stayed inside its own borders. Well, but Rogozin cannot admit this, because to do so would require confronting the fact that Russian soldiers are not being slaughtered because of Ukrainian substance. They are dying because Vladimir Putin invaded a sovereign country for absolutely no reason, other than his imperial nostalgia and personal pride. Well, and so Rogozin constructs a fantasy where Ukrainians are genetically cruel, while Russians are noble victims, and history is just a weapon he can bend into whatever shape suits the day's narrative. It is how it is. But this fantasy begins to fall apart the moment the conversation shifts to the battlefield tech that is tearing the Russian army apart. Namely, the drone warfare that even he could not ignore that it was superior to the Russian one. Let's talk about it in our next chapter. For all his racist ranting, Rogozin could not resist acknowledging one thing. Ukraine's unmanned system forces are terrifyingly effective. He meant it as an insult kinda, calling their operators sadists, monsters, or perfect commanders but scum. But in war, praise from your enemy counts more than 100 medals from your own government. And Rogozin has just confirmed that Ukrainian soldiers, Western analysts, and even Russian mothers have suspected for months. Drones are the only ones reshaping the battlefield faster than the Russian military can ever adapt. He described scenes that no amount of propaganda can ever spin away. Russian soldiers, for example, crawling through trenches, pipes, hearing the buzzing overhead, and just simply knowing that that's pretty much it, they have seconds left to live. Entire units wiped out by tiny machines carrying explosives worth less than just a pair of boots. 1,000 Russians reportedly eliminated each week by the drone forces led by Robert Brovdi alone, for example, callsign Madyar, a Hungarian-Ukrainian commander whom Rogozin both fears and hates. Mostly at the same time, equally, or sometimes fears more, I would say. The footage is literally everywhere. Russians sprinting, ducking, throwing their rifles at incoming drones because they have nothing else. And Rogozin calls this sadism, as though war on Ukrainian soil should be polite, honorable, and morally uplifting for the invading army. But here's what Rogozin never says out loud. These videos are being watched not just by Ukrainians cheering their defenders, but also by tens of thousands of Russian families searching for their missing men. Mothers, wives, sons scrolling through drone footage looking for familiar faces, not because they hope their loved ones survived, but because even confirmation of death feels better than just silence from the government. Russia no longer notifies family, probably better say Kremlin no longer notifies family or Ministry of Defense, because missing soldiers are cheaper than dead ones. Dead soldiers require compensation the state does not want to pay. Rogozin sees this slaughter. He knows the numbers. He knows how disproportionate the exchange rate is. He knows that Russia is losing far more than they publicly admit. And yet, in every sentence he tries to pretend the fault lies not with Putin's strategy or his own role in sending men to die, but with the genetic impurity of Ukraine's defenders. How would he even connect the dots here, but that's what he did. It's delusion, yes, but it's also fear, because the more drones Ukraine produces, the more Rogozin's worldview collapses. He then also proceeded to talk about one specific settlement where losses of the Russian military are absolutely catastrophic. The settlement not too many media people or content creators are talking about, because it's not as, fancy maybe as Bakhmut, Avdiivka or Pokrovsky, and yet it is equally deadly. Let's talk about it in our next chapter. Towards the end of this interview, Rogozin shifted to one of his favorite topics, Stepnohirsk, a small town in Zaporizhzhia that has become a graveyard for Russian soldiers. Since May 2023, Rogozin has invoked Stepnohirsk in dozens of his posts, describing it as though there was some kind of gateway to heaven itself. In reality, just a small settlement of just barely 4,000 people pre-war that has been shelled and flattened into dust. Yet, Rogozin demands that Russian troops storm it again and again, each assault more catastrophic than the last one. In July 2025, for example, he posted a dramatic message condemning Russians for enjoying concerts and street food, while the 247th Guards Air Assault Regiment was supposedly fighting for the nation's soul. In Stepnohirsk, like the settlement that most of you, even I personally, hear for the first time. But here is the uncomfortable question he never answers. How many Russians have already died trying to take a town smaller than a typical university campus? Thousands? Tens of thousands? More than the even pre-war population of the settlement? And what about the civilians who once lived there? If they are Russians, why destroy their homes? If they are a substance, why send Russian soldiers to die for land you claim that is inhabited by non-humans? This contradiction exposes the central lie of Rogozin's nationalism. He does not care about Russian people. He only cares about Russian conquest. The lives of conscripts, mobilized men, and volunteers mean nothing to him. They are just a fuel for a machine with absolutely no brakes. Meanwhile, Rogozin uses the harshest language to describe regular Russians trying to avoid mobilization, calling them cowards, parasites, draft dodgers, yet he never applies the same standards to himself. He could have stayed behind the camera, he could have refused his lieutenant colonel rank, he could have even admitted that the war is unwinnable. Instead, he chose to feed more men into a meat grinder he knows for sure cannot be stopped. And here is the most chilling part, at least for him. He's not alone. Russia's entire war economy now relies on two industries. One designing posters promising absurd bonuses to new recruits, and another burying the ones who discover the truth a little bit too late. The more you listen to Rogozin, the clearer it becomes that he is not an outlier but a symptom. He reflects the mindset of a regime that has long abandoned rational strategy and embraced pure inertia. Several months ago, for example, the United States and Europe attempted to push a ceasefire proposal where Putin would have kept the land he had already occupied. No punishment, no conditions, no consequences, just stop shooting, and that's kinda it. The sanctions would begin to fade slowly. Donald Trump himself pushed the idea, believing that Putin only needed respect and diplomatic patience. And as time passed, well, even Trump understood that many analysts said from day one. Putin never wanted an exit. He didn't even need one. Every option was offered, well, he rejected them altogether. Because ending the war would mean admitting failure, admitting that Russia did not conquer Kiev in 3 days, did not intimidate NATO, did not break Ukraine, and for sure did not resurrect a new empire. And so the war drags on, fueled not by strategy, but just simply by one man's ego. Even figures like Alexei Arestovich, who months ago insisted on avoiding provocations and making peace politically feasible, he even changed his course. He now publicly admits that you can tiptoe around Putin forever and nothing will change. Putin does not want peace, he wants time. Time to rebuild his army, time to tire the West, time to grind Ukraine to concessions that allow him to pretend that invasion was not the greatest strategic disaster of his entire career. But every day of this war proves completely the opposite. Russia loses more men, more towns are destroyed, more families plunge into uncertainty. And people like Rogozin continue to insist that Ukraine's defenders are genetically inferior creatures, because admitting the truth that Russians are dying by the thousands for nothing, this simple but real truth, this would break the spell that keeps Putinism alive. But most importantly, Rogozin confirmed what Ukrainians, analysts, and even many Russians already suspected for themselves. The suffering will not end because of diplomacy or negotiations or even respect. It will end only when Putin's ability to wage war collapses under its own weight. Under the drones, under the losses, under the fear, under the guilt, and under the silence of hundreds of thousands of families, waiting for answers they will never receive. And that is the tragic irony. Rogozin claims to fight for Russia, same as Putin. But everything he says, everything he believes, everything he promotes is accelerating the destruction of the very nation he pretends to so much love and to defend. Well, there you have it, guys. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support our work, there are links down below, for example, PayPal donations, Patreon memberships. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.